Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum finally going home. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. This has been a very long journey for Ethereum to get to this moment, and I want to go through what I think is the most likely outcome over the next few months and what to watch for. And we're going to look at it through the lens, of course, of what happened actually last cycle. We're also going to look at it through just the lens of monetary policy and quantitative tightening. So um, I know that market conditions like this are really difficult on a lot of people. And I do want people to remember that crypto is difficult, and even though we call for this sort of thing, right, we call for it to go home, and you know it did sort of become a meme just because of how long it ultimately has taken. Now that it's actually happening, the sentiment is starting to turn pretty sour. But if you can take a step back and look at the market through this lens, then I think it might start to make a bit more sense. Okay, so the way that I've really thought Ethereum would play out this cycle was through the lens of how it played out last cycle with monetary policy. Okay, and you can't truly analyze ETH without having some understanding of its Bitcoin valuation, right? The Bitcoin valuation tells you everything you need to know as far as whether if Ethereum is a good investment or not. You don't need to look at its USD valuation at all. And but we're going to look at it. We're going to look at it. I know a lot of people prefer the USD valuation. Now, we'll get to the S&P a little bit later because that also actually ties into what we're going to talk about. But with ETH Bitcoin, one of the things I want to mention is that ETH does not become a good investment as far as I'm concerned on its USD valuation until the Bitcoin valuation has bottomed. That's the way I think about it. Now you might say, well, hold on a second, Ben. You know, if ETH is at $1,000 over here, why is it such a bad thing to ride it up, right? Why is it such a bad thing? At the end of the day, if I haven't already convinced you with Bitcoin dominance, right? I'm probably not going to at this point. You're either think in terms of US dollars or you think in terms of sats. And no amount of pleading on my end is actually going to change your view. The only way that it's going to change, I think, is if you go through the cycles and you see how the cycles typically operate. So, it's not that ETH was incapable of going up on its USD pair. It's just that the only way it went up, as we know, was because Bitcoin went up, right? And it's pretty obvious because there has been this higher low support level that's been holding for a long time, right? And a lot of people thought that was a good thing for Ethereum. And this is where I've really struggled to connect with certain people and for certain people to see the market the way I see it. They see it as long as ETH holds support, that's a good thing for Ethereum. I argue it's a bad thing. And the reason is because as long as it holds support, ETH Bitcoin will bleed. That's the thesis. Now, that thesis could have been wrong, but that was the thesis that I've had, is that it doesn't mean that ETH can't go up. It just means that if it goes up, it's only because Bitcoin went up. So you can see that as ETH held support, ETH Bitcoin bled. So it's hard to really pat yourself on the back, in my mind, if you bought ETH when its valuation was 0.08 and now it's 0.02, right? And so that is the opportunity cost, right? It was a lot easier to just stick with Bitcoin and ride that thing up rather than watch Ethereum bleed to it for so many years. But when things get like this, it can be easy to forget what we've talked about. Okay? Now, ETH it's really easy to dunk on the Bitcoin valuation. And honestly, like I probably had a little bit too much fun dunking on it over the last few years. But if it is an oscillator, if you look at the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio, it is getting pretty close to the lows, right? It is getting pretty close to lows. Now, look, there's always a chance that Ethereum is a bleeder where it does not recover. I'm just being honest with you guys. I don't see it that way at this point. I don't see it that way. I think there is a decent chance that it will bottom out over here. But I also don't want to say that, like, I have to be right about that. Like, I could be wrong. Maybe I'm missing something. But I will say a lot of times when you look at the chart alone, there's no such thing as a coincidence. Okay? There's no such thing as a coincidence. When we talked about ETH Bitcoin bleeding back in 2022, I blamed quantitative tightening, right? I blamed quantitative tightening. And the reason that I blamed it was because it's an easy narrative to go with. And it does fundamentally make sense, right? It does, at a fundamental level, it makes sense that as the Fed makes monetary policy tighter and tighter, ETH Bitcoin will bleed. It did it last cycle. It has done it this cycle, right? But what's really interesting, and I want to look at this extremely closely so you guys can see what I'm saying. What's really interesting about this is if you look specifically at ETHUSD very closely, you will notice that last cycle it did the same thing that it's doing right now. The only difference is the time frame at which it occurred, over which it occurred. There was a wedge that was formed with ETHUSD last cycle as well, okay? And the wedge began during quantitative tightening, where ETH was essentially putting in higher lows, right? So if you look at these price labels, it was putting in higher lows every step of the way, right? You had it at around $83 right here, and then it sort of tested it, that higher low structure at 100. It then tested it at around 15, or sorry, at 150. And then ultimately it fell back into the wedge at around 200, right? Maybe a little over 200. That's where it ultimately fell back into the wedge. Now, the reason why this is important is because it was when ETHUSD fell through this wedge, it went into that bleed right there. Do you see what I'm talking about? You see that bleed. Look at it very closely. Let's zoom into it so you can see what I'm talking about. It went into this bleed. I remember that sentiment was awful, absolutely awful back in the summer of 2019. But do you see how it fell out of the wedge right there and bled? At the end of that 1 month bleed, sure enough, ETH Bitcoin bottomed. Right there at the end of the bleed. Pretty clear, right? See the purple line? This purple line is ETH Bitcoin. It bottomed after the sort of that 1 month bleed from the wedge was over. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the current cycle, you will see something identical, basically. You have a wedge, and you might say, well, hold on a second, Ben. Is this really the same thing, right? Is it really the same thing? From a quantitative tightening perspective, you can see that QT ended, the light blue line, it ended right after ETH fell out of the wedge. That's where quantitative tightening ended. You see right here? That's where quantitative tightening ended. That's where ETH Bitcoin bottomed, after it fell out of the wedge. Is it a coincidence that ETH is falling out of the wedge now? And as it's falling out of the wedge, the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio is nearing the same lows that it bottomed at in 2019. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so, right? I don't think so. So what I think it makes sense to look for here is as ETH bleeds down right here, right? As it bleeds down, if it follows last cycle, whenever it gets a move back up, potentially if the Fed were to end quantitative tightening, that could very well mark the bottom for ETH Bitcoin. Now, it's really difficult predicting when that's going to be. I don't know when they're going to end quantitative tightening. A lot of people want me to sort of say this is when it's going to happen. I don't know. I mean, they could end it in March. They could maybe wait until June or July. I really have no idea. If you look at the most recent FOMC minutes, it makes it sound like it'll be mid-year. If you look at the chart, if you look at this chart and this chart alone, it could obviously happen sooner. Now, back over there, the bleed lasted about 4 weeks. Is it going to take 4 weeks here? I don't know. It could take longer. I mean, the wedge took a lot longer this time, so maybe the bleed out takes a little bit longer before ETH Bitcoin bottoms. There's a possibility that that's the way it could play out. But what's really eerie about this analysis is that when you look at the low, like the low here for ETH was around 880 or something, which is basically a 10x from that low. And then the next tag of the trend line was when Ethereum was around 1,000, which is basically a 10x from the second tag of the trend line over there. And then the third tag of the trend line was at 1,500, which is basically a 10x from right here. And then as it fell back into the wedge right here, it was in the 2,000s, right? It was in the 2,000s, which is basically a 10x from where it fell into the wedge right there. Do you see how similar it is, right? I mean, a lot of these moves are just a 10x from 80 to 800, from 100 to 1,000, from 150 to 1,500, and then from a little over 200 to a little over 2,000. So you're essentially looking at the same pattern, just 10x higher, right? We're just looking at the same pattern. It's just 10x higher from where it was. And so ETH USD last cycle, when it fell out of the wedge, and whenever it got a rally after that, when quantitative tightening ended, that's where ETH Bitcoin bottomed. Okay? So what I think you look for here is if Ethereum continues this drop, right? If it continues this drop, and then you see a signal in a few months that the Fed has ended quantitative tightening, there's a good chance that that is the bottom for ETH Bitcoin. Now, a lot of people are going to come out and say, can the bottom already be in for ETH, for on its Bitcoin pair? Like, is it possible? It is possible, right? I'm not saying that it has to go lower, but I don't really expect it to go higher, right? I don't really expect it to go higher until quantitative tightening is over, at least not in a durable fashion. Right? It doesn't mean it can't bounce around, but I just wouldn't expect that until quantitative tightening is over. What's likely going to happen at some point is whenever quantitative tightening ends, it'll likely get a rally back up to the bull market support band, right? ETH Bitcoin will. You see that move by ETH Bitcoin? ETH Bitcoin will likely get a rally back up to the bull market support band whenever quantitative tightening is over. That doesn't mean that it's going to go through it immediately. It could take a little while, right? It might come back down and double bottom or something and then go through. The thing, though, to remember is that when ETH Bitcoin was doing that, when it was going up on its Bitcoin pair, it was actually bleeding on its USD pair. And this is sort of the hard part that I've tried to tell people for so long, is that, just because ETH Bitcoin bottoms doesn't mean that ETH USD can't go lower, right? It very well could. It all depends on how low Bitcoin has to go. Now, the reason it feels a little bit more likely this time that Ethereum will actually go home and really go deeper into the regression band is because Bitcoin is deviating from its normal seasonality. It is. And what better way to look at that than to just go to the website, right? We have this website, assuming that it actually loads. If you look at the running 1-year ROI for Bitcoin, it's basically been hovering at a 2x for a very long period of time, right? I mean, really going back over a year, it's been hovering at a 2x. One of the things we've said is that the only way for ETH to go home is for Bitcoin to drop itself, right? To deviate from normal seasonality. It's not really realistic to expect Ethereum to go home while Bitcoin just keeps on going higher. But if Bitcoin goes higher, it means ETH USD goes higher, but it means ETH Bitcoin bleeds. If Bitcoin goes lower, it leads to the Fed pivoting from QT and That doesn't mean they start QE immediately, but it means they could stop QT, and it could allow ETH Bitcoin to ultimately bottom out. Now, if you look at the 2019 move by Ethereum or by Bitcoin, you can see that it came up here, and then it also came off of that 1 year ROI, and it came back all the way down to like a 1.1, 1.2x move. You can see that the 1 year ROI of Bitcoin right now is about 1.354. So what I'm arguing here is that Ethereum is actually doing basically the same thing that it did last cycle. It's just taking place over a much longer period of time. The structure is the same, right? The structure is the same. You have your higher low structure where ETH Bitcoin bleeds while quantitative tightening is going on. You have a fall back into the wedge right here. Right here. When ETH USD fell back into the wedge, it was July of 2019. If you look at the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio in July of 2019, it was at around 0.13. Right now, it's at 0.17, but you can see just a few weeks ago, it went to 0.14. So when it went to 0.14, it was when ETH USD fell back into the wedge. So you could argue that in 2019, when ETH USD fell back into the wedge, the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio was 0.13. On the same day that that happened, this cycle, it went to 0.14. It's all very similar. It's all very similar. I think the reason why people struggle with this analysis is because it's just taking place over such a long period of time. And a lot of people are sort of getting more so focused on what, what is the market supposed to do based on what it did in 2017. But from a monetary policy perspective, you can see that this is how the market played out, right? ETH USD bled down into below the wedge. And as it bled down here, right, ETH Bitcoin bottomed out. And then ETH USD went lower, but not because ETH Bitcoin went lower. It went lower because Bitcoin went lower. And then it finally was over and the market was able to trend up again. So this is the way I see it right now. ETH USD will likely continue to drop below the wedge slowly. It's likely not going to all happen at once. You could have some counter trend rallies, but it's probably going to slowly drop below the wedge. At some point, I think that ETH Bitcoin will likely bottom out around the time that quantitative tightening is over. That does not mean ETH USD has bottomed out. What it means is that ETH USD will then just be somewhat slave to Bitcoin USD. If Bitcoin goes higher, then ETH Bitcoin can go up. But if Bitcoin goes lower, ETH Bitcoin can go up, but ETH USD will go down. Does that make sense? Hopefully it's clear as mud, right? But it's all about how do you manage your risk, and that's the way I see it. And if you're curious, like, what do I mean by Ethereum going home? Essentially, what happened last cycle is that after ETH fell out of the wedge, after it fell out of this wedge here, it then slowly bled into the logarithmic regression trend line, right? It slowly bled back down into it. And that's why this cycle, I keep repeating it. And again, it's become a meme because it's been going on for so long, and I think a lot of people have given up on it. But just because it hasn't happened, or it didn't happen over here, it doesn't mean that it won't, right? It doesn't mean that it won't. And arguably, that's what's happening right now. And if you look at some of the prior times where ETH USD fell back into its regression band, it would first have a wick down, and then sort of a week where it tries to hold on. And then, as market participants accepted it, it actually went down into it. Okay, that was in 2016. If you look at 2019, you can see the same thing, right? It first went into it. It then tried to stay, try to stop from going too far into it. And then investors capitulated in. There was a knee-jerk reaction when quantitative tightening ended, but ultimately the market bled down to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. So this cycle has actually been no different. You had a wick right here. The market tried to hold on, and now investors are recognizing that it's likely heading down here. And so that is how I view the market here. I know it's not popular, but I also, just because it's not popular doesn't mean it's wrong. Okay. One of the reasons why it might take a little longer for ETH Bitcoin to really start going up is because you could argue that you cannot get a period where alts outperform Bitcoin until ETH Bitcoin starts to go up. But also, ETH Bitcoin, as it stands right now, I'm not really that optimistic about it finding a ton of strength until all Bitcoin pairs go to the range lows themselves, right? ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio is getting pretty close to the range lows. You could argue it's already kind of there or very close to it. All Bitcoin pairs are still, 30 to 35% off their range lows, even like 36%. So one of the reasons why ETH Bitcoin might stay weak for a little longer is because all Bitcoin pairs still need to go down. And I think a lot of people bought altcoins, in sort of an expectation that a lot of new crypto investors would come to the space and buy up their altcoins so they could sell them, with the new administration and deregulation. But instead, we've just gotten a lot of meme coin rug pulls, and a lot of the retail investors have decided not to stay. And personally, you cannot blame them because, they come back after not being here for a while, and they're just met with sort of all these rug pulls, all these scams, and you have this massive misallocation of capital. By the way, the same thing happened in 2019, right? I mean, you had massive misallocation of capital over here. There was a lot of meme coins going crazy over there too. And then they got rinsed out. ETH went down. Sometimes ETH going down is what's needed to rinse out that stuff, right? Sometimes Bitcoin going down is what's needed to rinse out that stuff, right? And so that is ultimately what I think is happening right now, okay? So the way I think it's going to work is that, and I want to be clear about what I think is going to happen. I think you're likely going to see a slow bleed, a bottom by ETH Bitcoin when quantitative tightening is over. It might bleed a little bit longer. At some point later on, you'll likely get a rally like this, right? You likely will. During that rally, whenever that occurs, it's probably a ways off, honestly. Like, it's probably not going to happen right now. I think we need to go through the process of all Bitcoin pairs going to the range lows. I think ETH Bitcoin needs to bottom and then bounce and then double bottom, right? I think a lot of stuff has to happen. The Fed needs to pivot from quantitative tightening away. They need to pivot away from QT. Once we have all that behind us, if we're sitting here later this year, right? If we're just sitting here later this year and ETH USD is in this regression band, right? If it's all the way down here, and ETH Bitcoin is holding the lows, and it just feels like everything is just, no one cares anymore. That is when this rally can happen. That rally in 2019 or in 2020 ultimately led into a recession. Now, the same thing might happen. Actually. You might get a slow bleed. The labor market data, it's starting to worsen a little bit with initial claims, but the unemployment rate is still relatively low. Changes in immigration policy might keep the unemployment rate low for a while. The market's going to try to ignore it if it can, as the months go on, unless the unemployment rate starts to skyrocket. So you could argue that there is a case to be made that ETH USD could sort of bleed back down into the regression band, right? And sort of, you see that macro higher low from last cycle? You see what I'm talking about? A low, and then sort of a macro, not even the recession low, right? A macro higher low at the regression band. You have your low here. What if you get sort of a macro higher low at the regression band? And from that level, I think you would get a really big rally by Ethereum. I do. It's possible that it leads to a new high when that happens, right? It's possible. This rally over here went from 100 to 300. So if ETH goes down here to a number that I'm not going to say out loud, and it rallies, it could mean it goes back up to 3K if it follows this pattern. But you could argue that if the pandemic hadn't been so sudden and the unemployment rate hadn't gone to 10% overnight, this rally might have continued until the recession was more obvious. So you could get a scenario for ETH where it does this, big rally, and then the recession hits. You know, there was a time last cycle where I remember looking at this regression band. I remember like plotting it out in the future. I remember doing it because it was in 2019. And I was thinking to myself, you know, back over here, I was like, all right, well, you know, Ethereum's probably going to do pretty well. And hopefully it can go up to a few $1,000s this cycle. But I was looking at it and sort of fast forwarding the regression band in my mind. And I'm like, well, gosh, like even by 2025, the regression band is still only going to be at around $1,500, which, you know, kind of seemed insane to me at the time. I mean, even though when I created this regression band, I mean, Ethereum was at 150, just knowing that even by 2025, you could still see a $1,500 ETH, which I know sounds crazy, but guys, come on, ETH is at $2,200 right now. If Bitcoin coughs the wrong way, ETH will be there. You know, it's not that hard for ETH to go down there. And I didn't really know how it was going to play out, right? I really didn't. I just thought like, how is this going to play out in the context of the market cycles? And I tried to come up with all sorts of different explanations. And it turns out the way it has played out is just Ethereum continues to just stay right above it, not willing to go into it. And then maybe eventually it does. There's a pattern that we've talked about before that I always get a lot of flack for. And I understand where the flack's coming from. Most of these analogs never pan out, and so why assume this one's going to? But I do have a reason, and I will again express it once again. So if you look at interest rates in the United States and you subtract out the 2-year yield, there's a pattern where whenever this metric hits this trend line, there is ultimately a recession, right? Now, recession's a word that a lot of people don't want to say. And a lot of times they hit when you don't think they're going to hit. So when everyone's going around screaming that it's the golden age of crypto, maybe it's actually not. You know, maybe it's actually not. But here's the thing. Not all recessions are the same. And I don't want people to get caught off sides here. Yes, the last time that we tagged that trend line was in 2007, just before the financial crisis. And during the financial crisis, the market ultimately dropped about 50%, right? So it was a pretty big drop. Maybe even more than 50%. I think it might have been like 55%. It was a pretty big drop. 59, almost 60%. So there is always a chance that something catastrophic happens, and we follow that. But I also don't want people to sort of miss an opportunity because they're blinded by what happened during the financial crisis. And this is what I mean. When you look at this metric here, it tagged this trend line another time as well. Here, in 1989. In 1989. So, one of the tags of the trend line was the financial crisis, which was awful. The other tag of the trend line was 1989. The recession occurred in 1990. So the S&P actually topped, or it actually put in its final low back then when the recession occurred. But if you look closely, you'll see that comparison we've made to Ethereum, the triple top and then a low and then a lower low and then a final lower low, that lower low occurred after this metric came down and then bounced back up. Okay? So do you see that bounce by this metric? This is U.S. interest rates minus the 2-year yield. When it bounced back up, when it topped, that was the end of the recession for stocks. Now, maybe the actual recession with labor and stuff took a lot longer. I don't really know. At this point, I don't really care. But the market bottomed. This is what you guys are here for, right? The market bottomed right there on the third tag of the trend line. 1, 2, and 3. Look what's going on today. It hit this trend line. And look at this here. When it hit the trend line, it was the summer of 89. The market bottomed 1 year later. The market bottomed the summer of 1990. About 1 year later. Now look at this. When did it tag the trend line? The summer of 2024. So what if this isn't the craziest comparison to make? Right? What if it's not the craziest comparison to make? You can see right now that this metric is starting to go up. When this metric tops, right? When this metric tops, whenever it tops after this knee-jerk reaction, right? Like you got over here, when this metric tops, what if that is the bottom for risk assets? And what's interesting is that final low by the S&P 500 back then, right? That final low in the 1990s, right here, was the final tag of that trend line. 1, 2, and 3. Now, if you look at Ethereum, you have 1, 2, 3 is home. Maybe that's the recession. Maybe that's the recession bottom, right? I don't know, but it does make you wonder. I mean, look, guys, I've done this for a long time. And to be completely honest, these analogs almost never pan out how you think, right? They almost never pan out how you think. So I'm not asking you to go into this saying that like, all right, I'm going to use the S&P analog from 1989 to 1990 to tell me what's going to happen with Ethereum in 2025, right? Obviously, that's absurd. What I'm suggesting is that sometimes patterns can repeat themselves for various periods of time. I'm not showing you these analogs to tell you what will happen. I'm showing them to show you what can happen based on what has happened in the past. The assets that we trade can be different from one generation to another, but human emotion stays the same. That's what stays the same. If Ethereum is unable to bottom in this regression band, if it goes a lot lower, it's because there's some catastrophic recession, in my opinion. If it's your garden variety recession where the S&P just drops 20% like it dropped in 1990, it was just a 20% drop, then I don't see any reason why ETH can't just bottom in the regression band and then begin its journey up again. As long as the S&P only drops 20% in a recession. If the S&P drops 50%, then Ethereum basically has no chance of bottoming out in this regression band. It will go a lot lower. And you can see during the last recession in 2020, it went below the regression band. So if you do get an actual major recession a year from now or something, it can go well below the regression band. But there's not necessarily the evidence to support that. Now, of course, you could look at charts like this and say, well, the S&P 500 crashed 60% when it hit the trend line last time. Sure, but not all recessions are the same. Sometimes you do just get 20% drops. In fact, if you look when Reagan took office in the 1980s and 1981, we had an inflation problem back then. If you overlay the United States inflation rate year over year, when Reagan took office, it was in January 1981, the inflation rate was pretty high, right? And they had to get it under control, and they did. The S&P 500 during that time dropped about 28%. Right? It wasn't 50%, it was just 28%. So a lot of where Ethereum bottoms is going to be dependent on how low the S&P goes. Now, I put out tweets, and we talked about this a lot recently. I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the S&P is actually really important. The S&P is dropping right now. Fortunately for us, we said this was likely going to happen because what do we know about the S&P 500 in post-election years? You should already know. It drops, usually. There's a lot of weakness in the S&P 500 during this time of post-election years. And you can look at 2025 and compare it to the average of all prior post-election years going back to 1928. And you can see there's a lot of weakness during this time. A lot of weakness. That weakness is likely not going to go away until late March. There's a lot of weakness between options expiration in February that happened about a week ago and options expiration in March that happens in about 3 weeks or so. I don't remember exactly, but about 3 to 4 weeks. It might be interesting for you to know that the entire drop from the pandemic occurred between options expiration in February and options expiration in March. Now, that was an election year, not a post-election year, but that window can be a window of weakness. It's not always, right? I mean, last year, Bitcoin was strong. But when weakness presents itself at that time, it can be brutal. You know, it certainly can be brutal. So what I'm thinking right now is that, you know, the S&P is obviously in this correction. It might not even be a 20% drop right now. It might just be like a 5 to 10% drop. You know, I don't know necessarily that it has to drop 20% right now. I mean, it's already dropped 4.5%. A 10% drop basically gets the S&P back to 5,500. Okay? But if it's only a 20% drop and it just goes back to like the prior high, you know, from over here, then I would absolutely be on board with the idea of Ethereum just bottoming out in its regression band, ETH Bitcoin bottoming out whenever the Fed pivots from QT, and the market just going on like it always has. I understand the market is difficult, and I understand at this point, I think we're seeing more so time-based capitulation than anything else. People are giving up, right? People are giving up because the market isn't going how they want it to. My only point is that in order to get what you want, in order for Ethereum to go where you want to go, and I've said this for years, in order for Ethereum to do what you want, it has to go where you don't want it to go. As long as it does not, as long as it stays up here, then ETH Bitcoin goes lower because the Fed doesn't need to pivot in quantitative tightening. If ETH USD breaks down, there might be a reason to pivot. Not because the Fed cares about ETH, but because it sees what's going on in the rest of the market. Now, on a linear scale, this looks a little different, right? So on a log scale, it looks like Ethereum's already breaking down. Now, the week's not over yet, and there have been some wicks down here that ultimately were just wicks. But if this closes like that, then ETH USD is breaking down on the log scale. It has not broken down on a regular scale at this point, okay? So if you look at a regular scale, you can see that ETH USD still hasn't actually broken down. It could go as low as 2,100 and still technically not be below the support level. You see what I'm saying? So if you look at 2019 on a linear scale, you'll see something very similar, right? There was also the same higher low structure was in place, right? You could argue the same higher low structure was in place, and it went down to that trend line. It eventually got a rally back up to the bull market support band, but then eventually it did fade. Okay, so I'm not here to tell you it all has to happen immediately, but I am here to say that a lot of this stuff will eventually, more than likely, come to pass. I can't control what's going to happen next week, but I'm just here to tell you what I think will eventually happen. So those are my thoughts. I think that Ethereum is finally coming home, and I also think that if you look closely at the Ethereum logarithmic regression band, it's already knocking on the door, right? It's already knocking on the door. You can see that even at the time of this video, it's technically in the regression band, right? So it looks like it's happening. It's been a long thesis. Potentially it's finally playing out. Let's see what happens. Hopefully that helps you navigate the Cryptoverse as far as Ethereum is concerned. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.